Now on to the Maryland colony, and when we look at Maryland and Virginia combined, these are together the Chesapeake colonies, and we're still in chapter 2. Really quick though, before I go into the Maryland colonies, I wanted to give you an example of a thesis. So if you're struggling with that, here is a great example. So you can see here, this is a complex thesis. I wrote, Native Americans were not easy converts, and at this time, Jesuits learned that living among natives was the best way to manage conversion. Furthermore, they had to understand the natives in order to win them over. So you can see here that, first of all, I want to point out it's in past tense. I also want you to see I capitalized natives once, but it didn't every time. This would have been points off. Natives, when you're talking about Native Americans, needs to be capitalized. If you're just talking about like, I am native to the United States, like I am, then that would be a lowercase N for the native. So keep in mind, always capitalize natives when you're talking about Native Americans. But I want you to see that I have 3 points here in my thesis statement. I wouldn't expect you to necessarily have done that for one source, but this is the kind of thesis you would need for like an exam essay or for a paper. And then you can see I'm going to prove all these points. Now, normally what would happen is you would have this thesis in its own opening paragraph, and then each of these points that I have underlined in the different colors would be in their own body paragraphs that are separated out. So things like not easy converts, you can see I prove that with the words is not the work of a day. This missionary was showing that conversion work was difficult and a slow process. So you can see I use part of the source to prove that point. I directly link it back. Then you can see understand the natives. Then they cite that a missionary must learn exactly who he is dealing with, stating their language, customs, and manner of living. So I would need to tie that back and explain that a little bit more. So kind of keep that in mind. And then the last one, living among the natives was the best way to manage conversion. However, just understanding their culture is not enough. That should say was not enough. So keep to past tense, as he stated, past tense, that when necessary had been a barbarian with them. This shows that they must be willing to live with the natives in order to convert them. So you kind of keep in mind past tense when we're talking about the past. But then you notice here I have the section that wasn't underlined at all, and it says, but has also as a second meaning by calling the natives' actions as barbarian. Not only does the missionary take a tone that belittles the natives' own culture, but they're accepting that any action to win them over to Jesus Christ was acceptable. The thing is, this might have been a point that you had. Make sure you include all points in your thesis. So I wanted to have here an example that gave you some good things, but also an example that shows you some issues. But on to Maryland. So the thing is, with Virginia's eventual success, we're going to see that in 1632, King Charles I of England is going to go on to grant 10 million acres of land north of Virginia to the nobleman George Calvert. This colony of Maryland is a proprietary colony. What this means is it's basically the sole possession of Calvert and his heirs. He owns the colony and he could divide it up how it pleases him, and he has the right to set up like the colony's government and every single aspect of it. We're going to have some other proprietary colonies later. Sometimes it's not just an individual, sometimes it's a group of individuals and things like that. The thing is, this is a big deal because remember, England is a Protestant nation, but George Calvert was Catholic. Ooh, this is a big deal. The thing is, he really wanted Maryland to be like this refuge for others. The thing is, in England, Catholics generally paid double the amount of taxes as Protestants, and they weren't allowed to worship in public or hold any kind of political office. So Calvert had this plan for Maryland that he wanted to basically have his Catholic friends would own these manorial estates. They would be these manorial lords, and they would live off of the rent of the tenant farmers who would work the land and everything. And therefore, his Catholic friends would be the ones that were holding, governmental offices and running their own law courts and everything. However, before all of this could be implemented, Calvert died. And basically his plans unraveled. What happened is in 1634, colonists start moving in, but they are predominantly Protestant, and they were not willing to be like tenants and work for these Catholic estates. So instead, these Protestants that moved in would basically claim the land as their own. This process is going to continue on, and by 1640, basically they have a head right system set up the same way as like Virginia. But we're going to see at this same time, lots of problems are going on at home. So the fact that the king gave this whole proprietary colony to a Catholic kind of tells you where his intentions lay. Charles I, he's going to clash with Puritans and Protestants in general. Basically, we're going to see at this point the English Civil War, where Charles I is going to be beheaded in a rebellion, and Oliver Cromwell will take over the throne. He rules until about 1658 when he dies. The thing is, it was very much led by Oliver Cromwell. He didn't really want to be the leader of England, but they didn't really have an alternative. And so no one wants Oliver Cromwell's son to be the next, ruler of England. And so instead, basically, England invites back Charles I's exiled son to accept the throne. So we have all this upheaval during the 1640s and 50s, and Maryland Protestants are going to take advantage of this and try to contest Calvert's heirs' control over Maryland. What will happen is basically they're going to manage to establish a legislature that has 2 houses. Hey, that sounds familiar to today. The upper is going to be dominated by Catholics, but the lower legislature will be dominated by the Protestants. We're also going to see that Calvert's heirs in 1649 are going to approve the Act for Religious Toleration. This is the first law in America to call for the freedom of worship for all Christians. Though Protestants do manage later to pass a law that kept Catholics from voting. So that whole freedom of worship thing, there you go. Very much, Maryland resembles Virginia in a lot of ways, but they generally had a lot more peace with the local Native Americans, but they fought amongst themselves a lot more. So when we look at the Chesapeake Colonies overall, so this is Virginia and Maryland combined, there's a huge need for labor, and that means that a lot of the population is going to be male and young. So we have a lot of young men. And in fact, so much so that as late as 1700, sorry about that, Virginia basically is going to have 3 men for every 2 women. So women, you get more of your pick of the litter. Very few unmarried women had a hard time finding husbands. And in fact, if you were a widow, generally you're going to remarry pretty quickly. Keep in mind, we're going to see a natural increase, but really a lot of the increase of population is going to be people being imported over. So giving you some examples of number, in 1640, it's 8,000 people moved to these colonies. In 1660, it is 24,000 people moved. So that's a huge increase. We also have to keep in mind, before I look at point 2 and 3 here, this is a precarious life. There's a lot of disease. There's a lot of death. Settlers basically invest every penny in land and labor. It's not a comfortable life necessarily. Houses generally were no larger than 16 to 20 by 16 by 20 feet or so. They lived off of a diet of basically corn and pork. Malaria and other diseases inflicted that hardship. There's very few individuals in these colonies that were older than 50. And you have to keep in mind that this affects other parts of life because women were more susceptible to disease during pregnancy. And so that limits pregnancy to a certain extent. We're going to see that because of all of this death and everything, you get all kinds of family members living together. This could be step parents, children from different marriages, all living basically under the same roof because they had to on some level. We also see later marriages in life because you weren't allowed to get married until after, if you were an indentured servant, you weren't allowed to get married until after your terms of servitude were up. And so this also limits the size of family and natural population growth. That being said, women, when we look at women, widows who were women, they are going to have temporary control over their family property. and few would receive land outright. Though generally speaking, most of the time women would remarry and then their new spouses would take control. They have very little formal authority within society, but that one time that they might be widowed is the one time they could have control over their own property a bit more. Now, when it comes to the relationship with Native Americans, we are going to see over time the English population is slowly growing, and it is overwhelming Indian population. And so the Native Americans more and more often are going to start retreating and trying to keep a distance, especially because the high mortality rates from European diseases. This is just a quick map so you can see when we're looking at all these colonies, you can see the Chesapeake Colonies right there with Virginia and Maryland, that's in green. So I'm going to reference this map several different times at different places, so just kind of make note of it.